Yesterday, 9/11 was a reminder of the world we live in. Thankfully, not every day is as 9/11. But we were reminded of a devastation. We were reminded of terror. We were reminded of human evil and destruction. And what was interesting at the time was how America and the world responded. Many churches in New York called days of prayer. Many churches all over the world sought to support the American people at that time in different ways. And of course the wave of fear spread out. Wherever there was an American embassy or an American air base, there was great concern. Where do we go in the day of trouble? To whom do we turn when the challenges and the problems of life arise? They may not be quite like the challenges and problems of 9/11, but sometimes on your spirit, the weight of the problem and the weight of the difficulty is sometimes overwhelming. We've just sung, haven't we, this morning about sea billows and about trials and buffetings. So what direction do we turn? And what direction can we commend for other people to turn to with their fears, their anxieties and concerns, so that we as individuals, as families, as a church, and perhaps more and more as a nation, be able to say, in all this, it is well with my soul. That is the big question of the verses that we have read this morning. Israel and Judah particularly, has been attacked by the Assyrians. And Ahaz, their king, has led them into an unholy alliance, which had become itself destructive for them. So now Philistia and Moab, the two countries that are in our text this morning, Philistia and Moab want to seek an alliance with Judah. And so Judah, little Judah, small Judah, stands at a crossroads in its history. You notice here, King Ahaz died, verse 28 of chapter 14. And so on the brink of the death of one king and ruler and the appointment of another, which the book of 2 Kings tells us is Hezekiah, what is the great temptation? Well, the temptation is to continue to trust political power, political alliance. But it's proved disastrous. So now Philistia to the east and Moab to the west are pressing in. So to the left and to the right, there are challenges and there are problems. What should little Judah do? Well, you remember that back in chapter 2 and in verse 22, Isaiah has already warned, stop trusting in mere humans who have but a breath in their nostril. Why hold them in esteem? In other words, don't be looking to your left and to your right, to human help. Look to God. The whole of Isaiah and the whole of this section this morning, in one sense, is crying out to us, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not to your own understanding. It's the big life issue. Who are you going to trust? Who are you going to rely upon? Where are you going to find the basis and the foundation for living, for working, and one day for dying? Where are you going to find that basis? So although Philistia may seem far away this morning, and Moab may be far away, and you may be tempted to say, what on earth is this pastor doing, taking us to these ancient texts? Because the ancient text is talking about a modern issue. It's the issue of trust and reliance. Philistia and Moab as we saw in our reading this morning, are destined for destruction. So there is no reliability, there is no trustworthiness in these two nations. Ahaz had entered in already to an alliance. Ahaz was a king who came to the throne at the age of 21. He only lived to the age of 37. And over that 15-year period, he led the nation in pagan idolatry, child sacrifice, and all other kinds of rebellion against God. And it concluded, these were the words of Ahaz in the face of the problem of Assyria, "Come up and save me." He's not talking to God. He's talking to a Gentile pagan nation. Come and rescue me. Come and save me. And so Ahaz has died. Hezekiah takes the throne. It's a critical moment. Now, I'm aware that the outward surroundings, of course, are very different in the text. But there may be someone here this morning and you feel it's a critical period. There's pressure from the right and the left. So in principle, at least there's lessons here to learn. There's pressures, there's difficulties, there's temptations to be trusting other ideologies, other philosophies, other strategies. It's there for the church, isn't it? Who shall we trust? How are we going to go forward as God's people? Well, we see here, make no disastrous alliance with the pagan surrounding world. So Isaiah's prophecy comes as a challenge. When trouble comes, we need to be sure we're trusting the right person and our reliance is in the right place. Do you remember the night that Jesus spent with his disciples, the last night before he'd go to the cross? He looked at their faces, trouble. Trouble was written all over their faces. And Jesus speaks a wonderful word to them. He says, don't let your hearts be troubled. Now, on what basis could he say that? Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe, trust in me. Don't go trusting yourselves. Don't go trusting the religious authorities. Don't go trusting the Romans. Trust in me. You trust in God, trust in me. Trust is the big issue. So I want us to hear this morning the way that Isaiah does two things. Firstly, he dismantles and demolishes human trust in world powers. So there's a demolition job. Secondly, he builds and constructs the basis for trusting God. The demolition job, the dismantling. First of the Philistines, chapter 14, verses 28 following. It's just 3 verses, but in 3 simple verses, the fate of a whole nation is predicted in this prophetic oracle. So it doesn't take a big speech. It doesn't take a long time. Just in the compass of those 3 verses, in this God-inspired oracle, we see Isaiah predicting the demolition of the enemy. You may remember from last week, we saw at the end of the section in chapter 14, God's decree stands. What God speaks happens. The Lord Almighty has purposed. Who can thwart him? His hand is stretched out. Who can turn it back? Verse 27 of chapter 14. So here in these verses, there are graphic pictures that capture our imagination about the Philistines. Now, many of us from Sunday school lessons, you remember the Philistines. You remember Goliath, the king, the chief, the gladiator, Philistine, man from Philistine. And what happened to him? Well, little David from little Judah slew him. There were no problems because David's trust was in God. David was small, but David had a big God. And the big God of David speaks again. And the threatening Philistines, who'd been around for a long time and once had a champion warrior, they were conquered. And this nation again, cannot be trusted. Indeed, they're going to come to an end. How is that going to happen? Well, the graphic picture here is think snake. Think snake, think serpent, think of venomous, darting poison from the snake, which most probably means, in the context here, to the harvest of the Philistines, blight and famine will come. God will humble. God will bring this nation low again. And you notice at the place of government, the place of authority, verse 31, the gate in the city was the place where government met, where the elders met, the elders of the city. That place, what is it going to be characterized by? Sadness, sorrow. We've fallen, we failed, we're not great anymore. Melt away, all you Philistines. Just like the cloud of smoke comes from the north, there's going to be no stragglers in the ranks of the armies of the Philistines. That doesn't mean that God isn't going to be compassionate. Verse 30, the poorest will find pasture, the needy will lie down, but the root will be destroyed. I will slay. We know the track of Isaiah, warning to the nations, punishment, justice, judgment is coming. And you can't go to your temples. You can't go looking to the temples. You can't go looking to the religion that you have. And then in chapters 15 and 16, the fate of Moab is similar. It's going to be swift. In Moab is ruined, destroyed in a night. Kir in Moab is ruined, destroyed in a night. Dibon and Nebo and Medeba. Now, what's the purpose of all these names? Well, they're cities. We'll come back to that in a moment. So the cities of the pagan gods, the cities of the pagan peoples, the cities of Moab are also going to be destroyed. And the religious temples and the high places. Look at verse 2. You go up to the temple. You go to the high places of sacrifice. It's going to be of no help to you. Religion never, ever can be the basis of help. And so in these two chapters, 15 and 16, we see again the demolition, the pulling down of Moab. And what's the issue? What's the problem? What does Moab stand for? Well, look at verse 6 of chapter 16. We have heard of Moab's pride, her overweening pride and conceit, her pride, her insolence, and her boasts. But they're all empty. The sin and the failure lies where it lies for all humanity, where it lies for me in a pulpit, and where it lies for you in the pew, pride. From the very beginning of time, you may remember we saw last week, O morning star, how you have fallen from heaven. The pride of the human heart is the big issue. Self-reliance, self-confidence, and self-esteem. Self-esteem that runs riot and cannot be contained. But there is no framework for God. There's no framework for God. There's no humble dependence on him. And the main boast seemed to be, as the axe is going to fall, is on the resources which brought wealth and prosperity. Look at verses 8 and 10. The fields of Heshbon, the vines of Sibmah, the choicest vines which once reached Jazer, spread through the desert, the shoots spreading out that went as far as the sea. This was a prosperous country. This was a fruitful country. The agricultural produce, that's where all the wealth and prosperity came. In the fields, the vines, the vineyards, the orchards, the wine, the ripened fruit and the harvest. But you have all this. But in Moab, there's no talk of a creator God. There's no song sung on the harvest time of Moab. Great is your faithfulness, springtime and harvest. It's not there. There's no God. And as I say, this is not a particular problem for Moab. Since the fall in Eden's paradise of our first parents, the temptation of the human heart is to trust in ourselves and our own resources. It's to accept the gifts of God, but to deny his existence, or to deny that they ever come from him. One commentator puts it in this way: God opposes the proud, high thoughts, high and mighty attitudes, arrogance and self-centeredness will slay the highest and the lowest. And again, competition, performance, and merit religion, they may thrive because they're self-centered, but Moab will still be humbled. They cannot look to themselves. In 1863, an American president, Abraham Lincoln, I'm not very good at American history, but I think he was a great American president. He had a faith and he had a trust. And at a particular time, in 1863, he proclaimed with other governors a day of national humiliation. Not sure what the exact details were, others can fill me in. But just think of this. If tomorrow morning's headlines were this: the President of America, in alliance with the President and the Prime Ministers of all the world, are proclaiming a day of international, or for us, national humiliation. And you think to yourself, we need to be humbled then. We need to be humbled. Listen to the words of Abraham Lincoln. He says, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We've grown in numbers, wealth, power. No other nation has ever grown like us. But," from the lips of the President of America, you hear these words, "but we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. We have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by our superior wisdom and the virtue of us. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient." And listen to this line from the lips of a president. "We have become too sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace." I'm just fascinated that a politician can make that distinction. Redeeming and persevering grace. We have forgotten it. Too proud to pray to God that made us. So what do you do in a moment like that? You call a day of prayer for the humiliation of a nation. Moab and Philistia and Israel and Judah and today our nations, we need to be humbled. We need to stop looking where we've been looking for power and strength and philosophy and every other little god we may have set up. We've often sung, and perhaps we should sing more often, "Forbid it, Lord. Forbid it that I should boast, save in the death of Christ my God. All the vain things from Moab and Philistia that charm me most, I sacrifice them to his blood." Am I willing to face the challenge personally? Are we willing to face the challenge as a church? Can we call our nation to face the challenge? Put your trust in God. Put your trust in Jesus Christ. There is no one else to trust. And so there's a second point, and it's a glorious alternative. And thank God there is an alternative to trusting in the nations. There's a safer, there's a more secure alternative. And I want us to read these great verses. The first one is in chapter 14, right at the end in verse 32. "The Lord has established Zion. There's another city. All the other cities mentioned, they're going to crumble and fall into the dust. But the Lord has established Zion. And in her, his afflicted people will find refuge. We're letting the fresh air in. We're letting the oxygen in. The oxygen of grace and mercy is coming in the promise of God. And he hasn't finished, has he? Chapter 16, verse 5. In love, a throne will be established. In faithfulness, a man will sit on it, one from the house of David, one who in judging seeks justice, speeds the cause of righteousness. There is no wonder that Isaiah is called the evangelical prophet of the Old Testament. Here is the confidence. Here is the basis. Here is the foundation. Watch Isaiah build, brick by brick, a constructing great bulwark of mercy and of grace for the people of God. Let me summarize the three great blessings. There is an established city, there is an established throne, and there is a man. There is a man from the house of David. And this threefold promise is a part of what the whole of Isaiah is going to do in his prophecy, is build the basis. Why do we need Messiah Jesus? Who is Messiah Jesus? What are the characteristics of Messiah Jesus? And what will be the great accomplishments of the Lord Jesus when he comes? Isaiah is looking down the corridor of history, and he sees a kingdom, and he sees a king on a throne. And he sees all the glorious attributes of this Lord Jesus Christ. The city of God, number one. The city of God is Mount Zion. Now, this is not the first time Isaiah's brought this to our attention. You may remember chapter 1 and 2. He calls Zion the city of righteousness. While the unrighteousness of Israel and Judah and the nations around is crumbling everything, God has a city that is marked by his righteousness. Chapter 1 and 2. It's the faithful city. Zion will be redeemed with justice. God is going to spare his people, not because they're any better than any other people, but because his decree of mercy and redemption. The mountain of the Lord, chapter 4. Do you remember that great phrase? The mountain of the Lord. Those who are left in Zion. There will be a remnant in Zion. They'll remain in Jerusalem. They'll be called holy. All who are recorded among the living. There's a register, if you like, and there are recorded names on the register of all those who will be saved. And then we see in chapter 12, shout aloud, sing for joy, people of Zion. Why? What is it that distinguishes you more than anything else? The Holy One of Israel is among you. Zion has the presence of God. Zion has God as its refuge and as its strength. Now we're in New Testament times. What does Zion symbolize? Well, by using Hebrews and the book of Revelation, we're thinking of the church. And the church comes, if you like, in two layers. There's the church on earth, and there's the church in heaven. And one day the church on earth and the church in heaven will be united. Zion, city of our God. But we become, as we saw in our series on the church, we become members of this city. We become citizens of the New Jerusalem as we come to trust in God. And that is why the hymn writer John Newton could sing, glorious things of thee are spoken, Zion, city of our God. If by grace I am a member. We are members this morning of the abiding, secure city of God. Faith is the passport in. Faith puts our names on the register. It is by faith we become a part of the church on earth. And it is by faith that one day the church on earth and the church in heaven will be joined together forever and forever. It's an abiding city. It's a lasting city. And you may ask yourself, what is it that makes the city so safe? What is it that makes the city a place, as we see here, of refuge? In the city, there is a throne. Isaiah chapter 6 reminded us, didn't it? It is a high throne. It is a holy throne. It is a throne occupied by the Lord God Almighty. It is a throne that transcends all other thrones. It is the place of God's government. It is the place of God's authority. It is the place where God rules everything for the sake of his church. And there, we are told, there is a throne. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne. Not only is a throne established of government and peace, but there's a man on the throne. I don't know about you, but get out your binoculars, get out your telescope, have a look. Who's this man? Who's this man upon the throne? Well, we are told here that in love a throne is established. And so if in love a throne is established, in love a man is put upon that throne. The little word here for love, I don't have much Hebrew, but the Hebrew tells me it's the word covenant love. In covenant love, there's a man upon the throne. What's that covenant? Well, here's the hint. One from the house of David. You remember the covenant of God to David in Samuel? There will be someone on your throne, and it just won't be Solomon, and it just won't be all the imperfect kings that will follow. But as you open up Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 1, we are told that it is Jesus who will be on the throne. So we are told from Isaiah 7, the virgin shall conceive, Emmanuel. We are told from chapter 9, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Here's the man upon the throne. Here's the one that down the corridors of history again, Isaiah can see. He's the man who is God. My nature, human nature, and God's nature and God's person meet in Jesus Christ. So the man upon the throne, we are not surprised, is there in faithfulness. And not only is he there in faithfulness, but we are told that he will judge, seeking justice, and he will speed the cause of righteousness. There's hope. In an unjust age, where do you find justice? In this man. When unrighteousness abounds, and it's affecting our lives, and it's affecting our society, it's affecting our families. Where am I going to find righteousness? Please give me a righteousness that lasts. You find it in this man. Where are we going to find justice? Where are we going to find everything that we need? You're going to find it in this man. In love. God has ordained a throne and a man to sit on it. It's in the deep, deep love of God in Jesus Christ. And we are called then to come and trust this God who is giving us these wonderful promises. There's a city, there's a throne, and there's a man. 3 great promises. A love that will never let us go. A real man, a perfect man, with the stunning characteristics of faithfulness, justice, and righteousness. And we can say this morning with the hymn writer of old, we can look to the north, we can look to the south and all its Philistias, we can look to the west and all its Moabs, north, south, west, we can look to the east, and all that the east seems to promise with all its religions, we can look to them and we can say, there's no city like this city. There's no throne like this throne. And there is no man in the whole of human history like this man. And God is saying, Put your trust in him. God is saying, take this promise, cherish it, love it, because it's the promise of God's preservation in the day of danger and in the day of trouble. By faith, take this man to be your refuge, to be your hiding place. And then you can say, with great confidence, and you might like to say it with me under your masks, it is well. It is well with my soul. Heavenly